What if the real story of American power did not begin in Congress, on Wall Street, or in the White House, but in the forgotten gold fields where a handful of families quietly learned to bend the world to their will? This question may sound provocative, but once you trace the roots of these early clans, you begin to see a pattern forming beneath the surface. It all starts with a deceptively simple idea. Control the gold, and you control the destiny of nations. While most people saw gold as wealth, these families saw something far more powerful. They saw influence, leverage, and the possibility of shaping entire economic cycles long before the rest of the world understood what was happening. Picture the moment when the first veins of gold were extracted from the American frontier. For many, it represented fortune. For a few, it represented opportunity on a scale the world had never seen. These early clans were not just mining metal, they were mining the foundation of geopolitical authority. They began tracing global roots, studying how empires rose and fell, learning from ancient cycles of collapse, and preparing themselves to do what no dynasty before them had done: convert mineral wealth into global dominance. And the more gold they accumulated, the more invisible their power became. It was never just about owning mines. It was about buying influence, securing alliances, and positioning themselves in the blind spots of international systems. As these families expanded, they learned to read hidden signals in markets, currencies, and political shifts. What looked like chaos to the average observer was, for them, a pattern, a roadmap, a way to anticipate crises and use them as stepping stones to greater control. You might even recognize some of these signals in your own life, because the echoes of those early moves still shape the economy we live in today. You ever feel like certain events are not coincidences at all, but deeply connected? What you are about to discover may surprise you, and it might change the way you look at global power forever. Before we continue, share your thoughts. Have you ever sensed that wealth and influence operate in ways most people never see? Leave a comment and tell me your experience. And while you're here, make sure to like the video and check if you are already subscribed, because understanding this story is essential as we uncover the next layers of how these clans shape the world, leading us toward what comes next in this unfolding narrative. As the first generation of these American clans expanded their foothold, the role of gold began to evolve into something far more complex than a precious metal. To them, gold was not merely a commodity, but a strategic instrument, a silent engine capable of shifting the balance of global power. While the public celebrated gold rushes as symbols of prosperity, these families studied how each new discovery reshaped the economic landscape. They mapped the flow of gold across continents, observing how empires depended on it to stabilize their currencies, wage their wars, and secure their alliances. This understanding gave them an extraordinary advantage. They knew that whoever mastered the circulation of gold would ultimately influence the direction of nations. With this insight, they moved beyond extraction and began to integrate themselves into the financial arteries of the world. Mining camps evolved into trade networks, and these networks evolved into banking relationships. Gold was the bridge that allowed them to step from the frontier into the international arena. They quietly inserted themselves into negotiations between governments, brokers, and merchants, learning how to leverage scarcity and abundance to steer outcomes. Even when gold prices fluctuated wildly, they understood that volatility itself created opportunities. The more unstable the environment, the more influence they gained by being the ones who could provide stability when others faltered. Meanwhile, average citizens saw only fragments of the larger story. Gold was portrayed as security, investment, or tradition, but few recognized its role as a tool for consolidating soft power. These clans used it with precision, converting gold reserves into political favors, maritime contracts, land grants, and strategic access to foreign markets. They were building far more than wealth. They were building systems of dependency. Once a government relied on their shipments, their financing, or their trade routes, distancing from them became nearly impossible. And as their influence deepened, these families began to see a repeating pattern in how nations responded to economic pressure. They noticed signs that preceded major collapses or shifts, and learned how to move resources ahead of time, positioning themselves exactly where the next wave of opportunity would rise. This growing mastery of global dynamics marked the beginning of a new era for these clans, one in which gold ceased to be the end goal and instead became the foundation upon which they would construct something even more expansive, setting the stage for the next transformation in their ascent. As these clans expanded their reach beyond the gold fields and into the veins of global finance, they began noticing another crucial element that would accelerate their rise: the fusion between mineral wealth and political influence. Gold alone was powerful, but gold combined with political leverage created a force capable of shifting the direction of entire economies. Early on, these families observed how governments reacted to scarcity, inflation, war, and debt. They learned that political elites relied heavily on those who could provide liquidity in moments of crisis. and this realization became the cornerstone of their next strategic move. Rather than simply supplying gold, they positioned themselves as indispensable partners to governments that lacked stability or credibility. This shift reshaped the relationship between economic power and political survival. These clans began financing infrastructure projects, underwriting war efforts, and providing emergency reserves when national treasuries ran dry. Each intervention strengthened their position and deepened governmental dependence. What looked like generosity on the surface was, in reality, the construction of long-term influence. They were no longer just wealthy families. They were becoming quiet architects of national policies. By controlling when and how gold entered or exited a country, they gained extraordinary leverage over laws, regulations, and strategic decisions. At the same time, they studied how previous empires had collapsed under the weight of mismanaged resources, external pressure, or internal corruption. They realized that every economic system contained weak points that could be either exploited or reinforced, depending on their objectives. This understanding allowed them to anticipate political behavior with uncanny accuracy. When a nation inflated its currency, they knew a purge of value would follow. When a government overextended militarily, they saw the fiscal strain before it became visible to the public. Each pattern provided a roadmap, and the more they identified these repeating cycles, the more confident they grew in navigating and manipulating them. By now, their operations extended far beyond American borders. Their networks spanned ports, trading houses, diplomatic channels, and banking institutions in multiple continents. And as global tensions rose, their understanding of economic triggers made them appear almost prophetic. People wondered how they always moved ahead of events, how they managed to profit when others collapsed. But to them, it was never luck. It was the inevitable outcome of studying history, patterns, and human behavior so deeply that crisis became predictable. And this predictive ability opened the door to a new phase of expansion, one that would change the scale of their ambitions and push them further onto the world stage, shaping their next strategic evolution. As the influence of these clans expanded across continents, a shift began to unfold that would redefine their power entirely. Gold had given them leverage, but what they craved now was something far greater: the ability to shape the global marketplace itself. This new ambition demanded a strategy that went beyond extraction, beyond finance, beyond diplomacy. It required acquiring assets and infrastructures so essential that entire nations would depend on them. And so began the phase that historians later described as the moment when these American families started, quite literally, buying the world. They began with shipping routes, purchasing shares in maritime companies that controlled the flow of goods between continents. Then came investments in ports, telegraph cables, banks, and insurance houses. None of these acquisitions seemed threatening individually, but when viewed together, they formed an interconnected web of influence that placed them at the center of global commerce. Every shipment, every message, every transaction quietly enriched their network. They were transforming themselves from gold merchants into architects of international trade. What made their expansion so effective was the subtlety with which they operated. They rarely placed their names on official documents, choosing instead to act through intermediaries, holding companies in discreet partnerships. This invisibility protected them from public scrutiny and allowed them to influence political negotiations from the shadows. Governments believed they were dealing with separate entities, unaware that many of these companies were controlled by the same handful of families. And with every acquisition, the clans gained another layer of insulation, making it nearly impossible for regulators or rival powers to trace their growing empire. At the same time, they refined their understanding of geopolitical patterns. They learned that the best opportunities emerged during uncertainty. When a nation faced economic collapse, they stepped in to purchase undervalued assets. When war disrupted supply chains, they bought transportation networks. When currency crises shook markets, they acquired banks at fractions of their worth. Each crisis became a doorway, and they passed through it with precision. To them, instability was not a threat, but a catalyst for expansion. As their holdings spread from Europe to Asia, Africa, and Latin America, a new realization crystallized among these clans. The world could be shaped not through domination, but through ownership. And ownership, once established, created a form of power that was quiet, permanent, and nearly impossible to challenge. Their global footprint was no longer a portfolio. It was the foundation of a system they intended to control for generations. Before we move forward, share your perspective. What do you think about the idea of families expanding influence by quietly buying critical pieces of the world? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or the patterns you have noticed in today's global economy. As these clans strengthened their grip on global infrastructure, a subtle transformation began to take place. Gold was no longer the centerpiece of their strategy. It had evolved into something far more potent. They realized that the true power of gold did not lie in its shine or scarcity, but in its ability to be converted into influence across every sector of the world economy. Over time, their vast reserves became a financing engine that fueled political ambitions, multinational mergers, and large-scale industrial expansions. They were no longer responding to the global system. They were beginning to shape it from within. This new phase required them to rethink how wealth functioned on a geopolitical scale. They studied not only the untold flow of assets, but also the psychology of markets, the vulnerabilities of governments, and the fears that drove entire populations to support or resist change. Their goal was no longer simply to acquire, it was to position themselves as indispensable. When a country struggled with inflation, they offered stabilization. When industries collapsed under debt, they provided restructuring. When international tensions threatened trade, they stepped in to mediate through financial leverage. Every solution they offered was designed to deepen reliance on their network. At the same time, they refined their techniques for converting gold into intangible forms of power. They funded universities and think tanks that influenced economic theories and long-term policy. They infiltrated financial boards where monetary decisions were crafted. They invested in communication channels capable of shaping public perception. Though their names rarely appeared publicly, their fingerprints were visible in decisions that guided interest rates, monetary reforms, and foreign investment policies. Through this quiet architecture, they found a way to direct the global flow of capital without ever stepping onto a political stage. This shift allowed them to navigate crises with extraordinary precision. When markets trembled, they decided which institutions were preserved and which were allowed to fall. When new technologies emerged, they identified which innovations would become essential to future economies. Their understanding of global cycles enabled them to transition seamlessly from gold to oil, from oil to finance, from finance to technology. They did not fear the evolution of markets. They anticipated it, prepared for it, and used it to fortify their influence even further. Yet, beneath all of this expansion, a deeper pattern was starting to emerge, one that would redefine their strategy again and reveal how far they were willing to go to maintain dominance in a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected. As their influence expanded across continents and industries, these clans understood that maintaining power required more than wealth and strategic acquisitions. It demanded the creation of a global network capable of operating even when borders shifted, alliances broke, and political landscapes transformed overnight. This realization marked the beginning of their most intricate project, constructing a web of alliances, financial institutions, and international partnerships that would make their influence resilient, adaptable, and nearly invisible. What began as a series of negotiations evolved into a complex system of interconnected entities, each reinforcing and protecting the other. They forged discrete relationships with banks that handled international settlements, ensuring they could move capital across the world with minimal friction. They supported the rise of insurance companies that underwrote maritime trade, allowing them to control risk in global commerce. They funded research centers that produced economic forecasts, shaping how nations interpreted global trends. Their presence became woven into the very fabric of international stability, making it almost impossible for governments to function without relying on at least some part of their network. Yet this dependence remained largely unspoken, hidden beneath layers of intermediaries and corporate structures. One of their most effective strategies was cultivating influence across multiple political systems at the same time. While nations competed for dominance, these clans operated above the conflict, ensuring they held leverage with every side. When a government sought foreign investment, their institutions appeared as saviors. When another needed emergency credit, they provided liquidity. When diplomatic tensions threatened trade, they acted as informal intermediaries, stabilizing markets in ways that appeared altruistic but always served their long-term agenda. By positioning themselves as indispensable partners rather than overt rulers, they secured a form of power that was both subtle and enduring. Their alliances were not limited to Western powers. They extended their reach into emerging economies where infrastructure demands created fertile ground for influence. Railroads, ports, communication lines, and financial systems became footholds for expanding their presence. Each project deepened local dependence while strengthening the global web they were constructing. And as their network grew, so did their ability to anticipate disruptions. They could sense when a currency shift in Asia would trigger political instability in Europe, or when a collapse in one commodity market would create opportunity in another. Their system was designed to absorb shocks, redistribute influence, and preserve their advantage regardless of how the world changed. Through this vast and carefully orchestrated web, the clans built something unprecedented, a distributed empire with no capital city, no single leader, and no flag. An empire held together not by force, but by interdependence, information, and strategic ownership. And the deeper this network extended, the more clearly they began to see repeating patterns that would shape their next moves, guiding them toward an even more sophisticated understanding of global power. As the clans strengthened their global web, something remarkable began to emerge from the patterns they had spent decades deciphering. They realized that the rise and fall of markets, the collapse of empires, and the restructuring of economies were not random events, but part of a repeating historical rhythm. By studying cycles of expansion, stagnation, crisis, and recovery, they uncovered signals that allowed them to anticipate global shifts before they became visible to the rest of the world. These families were no longer reacting to change. They were predicting it, shaping it, and quietly using it to consolidate even more influence. They mapped the world as if it were a living organism, tracking how political tensions, resource shortages, currency fluctuations, and social upheavals pulsed through the international system. From ancient civilizations that had risen on the strength of trade routes to modern superpowers built on financial architectures, the clans saw echoes of the same vulnerabilities repeating across time. They understood that every empire inflated its currency before decline, that every government overspent in pursuit of ambition, and that every boom created the seeds of its own collapse. This insight gave them a strategic vantage point unlike anything seen before. Rather than fearing instability, they learned to position themselves at the threshold of each major transition. When they sensed an asset bubble forming, they stepped back and shifted into safer reserves. When a nation approached debt saturation, they acquired undervalued infrastructure. When technological revolutions disrupted labor markets, they invested in the companies that would define the next era. And while the world interpreted these shifts as chaos, the clans saw a script unfolding exactly as history had shown. Their role was not to stop the cycles, but to ride them, guiding their network through each turning point while strengthening their foundation. This predictive power became one of their most valuable assets. It allowed them to weather crises that toppled governments and crushed industries. It enabled them to foresee diplomatic ruptures, commodity shortages, and monetary resets. The more they studied the past, the more clearly they perceived the future, not as prophecy, but as pattern. And with each successful anticipation, their confidence grew, revealing to them that the next phase of global transformation was approaching faster than anyone else realized. Before we continue, share your perspective. What patterns have you noticed in today's world that feel like echoes of past cycles? Leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences, and tell me which signals you believe are shaping the future right now. As the clans refined their predictive abilities, they became increasingly aware that the greatest accelerators of their influence were not periods of stability, but moments of global upheaval. Crises that devastated nations often opened doors for them to expand their reach. Economic recessions, currency collapses, geopolitical conflicts, and sudden market shocks created vulnerabilities that these families were uniquely positioned to exploit. To the public, these disruptions seemed catastrophic. To the clans, they were signals, markers that the cycle was shifting and new opportunities were emerging. They recognized that during periods of turmoil, governments and corporations often acted out of desperation, abandoning long-term planning in favor of immediate survival. This created an environment where assets could be acquired at a fraction of their true value. Ports, banks, mines, energy grids, and even national debts became available to those with the liquidity and foresight to seize them. And because these families had positioned themselves with diversified reserves and global networks, they could move quickly, purchasing strategic infrastructure while competitors hesitated or collapsed. Every crisis that shook the world tightened their grip on the international system. The clans also understood how panic shaped human behavior. They studied how populations reacted to uncertainty, how markets responded to fear, and how political leaders used moments of instability to justify sweeping reforms. By anticipating these reactions, they could position themselves to benefit from policy changes long before they were implemented. When nations devalued their currencies, the clans moved their reserves. When new regulatory frameworks appeared, they had already prepared their portfolios. Their predictive models allowed them to operate with an almost unnatural calm while the rest of the world scrambled for stability. Technological change added another layer to their strategy. Innovations in communication and finance amplified the speed at which crises unfolded, but they also increased the speed at which opportunities emerged. These families invested heavily in early financial technologies that allowed them to move capital instantly across borders, evading restrictions and exploiting differences in market conditions. They became experts at arbitrage not only in commodities but in governance, exploiting gaps between legal systems to protect and grow their assets. What the public perceived as unpredictable chaos was, to them, a familiar sequence of events, each crisis revealing where the next center of power would shift. And as these patterns became clearer, the clans began preparing for a transformation unlike anything they had encountered before, one that would redefine their strategies and reshape the balance of global power once again. As the world entered the modern age, the clans discovered that influence no longer depended solely on controlling physical assets. The emergence of digital markets, globalized finance, and instantaneous information transformed the battlefield of power. Traditional empires had ruled with armies and borders, but the new empire was built on data, networks, and the ability to anticipate market movements before anyone else. The clans recognized this shift earlier than most, and they adapted with remarkable precision. They transitioned from owning gold and infrastructure to shaping systems that governed the global flow of capital itself. They embedded themselves into financial institutions that processed international transactions, gaining visibility into the movement of money across continents. This insight allowed them to predict trends with extraordinary accuracy. They could see when capital fled a region, when investors grew anxious, and when governments attempted to stabilize markets. They used this information to position themselves advantageously, entering or exiting sectors long before public sentiment shifted. To the outside world, their accuracy seemed uncanny, but it was the natural result of decades spent constructing networks that captured information at its source. Their power also grew through strategic investments in emerging technologies. They understood that whoever controlled communication architectures would control the narratives shaping global behavior. So they quietly funded companies involved in telecommunications, data storage, and later artificial intelligence. These investments were not merely about profit. They were about influence over how societies interpreted events, how markets reacted to news, and how governments communicated with their populations. Through these channels, they could subtly direct attention, fuel speculation, or temper panic, all without issuing a single public statement. Another key evolution was their mastery of shadow ownership. Instead of holding visible stakes in corporations, they used private trusts, offshore structures, and interlinked holding companies to conceal their involvement. This invisibility allowed them to influence board decisions, mergers, and international agreements without attracting scrutiny. By the time regulators suspected a pattern, the ownership web was too complex to track. This deliberate opacity became one of their strongest defenses, ensuring they could navigate political storms without becoming targets. As global markets grew more interconnected, the clans realized something profound. Control no longer required domination. It required synchronization. If they could align their networks with the cycles of technological innovation, economic expansion, and geopolitical tension, they could guide outcomes without forcing them. And in this subtle form of control, they found a new frontier of influence, one that set the stage for the most critical turning point yet, a moment when all the patterns they had followed would converge and reveal the future shape of global power. As the clans stepped into the new century, they found themselves standing at the intersection of every major global system they had spent generations studying. The cycles they had decoded were shifting again, revealing a convergence of economic tensions, technological revolutions, and geopolitical realignments unlike anything seen before. Their networks had infiltrated finance, infrastructure, communication, and data, but now the question was no longer how to expand influence, but how to preserve it in a world where power was becoming fluid, decentralized, and increasingly unpredictable. They understood that the next era would not be controlled by a single resource or technology, but by those who could adapt the fastest to the changing rhythm of global transformation. They began observing how digital currencies challenged traditional banking systems, how automation reshaped labor markets, and how political polarization fractured alliances that had once seemed unbreakable. They saw how nations struggled to navigate a new landscape where economic might depended less on physical boundaries and more on algorithmic intelligence and information flows. These shifts did not intimidate the clans. They intrigued them. For decades, they had mastered cycles of scarcity and abundance, collapse and recovery. Now, they turned their attention to cycles of innovation, disruption, and reinvention. Their strategy evolved once more. Instead of focusing solely on tangible assets, they invested in systems that interpreted global movements in real time. They built partnerships with emerging tech companies, funded research into predictive modeling, and embedded themselves into platforms that tracked political sentiment across continents. Through these channels, they gained a deeper understanding of how society responded to uncertainty, how markets absorbed shocks, and how the collective mindset shaped the momentum of global change. The more data they gathered, the more clearly they recognized the familiar patterns they had spent lifetimes decoding, now manifesting in a new digital form. Yet they also sensed a turning point approaching. The cycles of the past were accelerating, overlapping, and merging into a new configuration. Old economic structures were straining under the pressure of rapid transformation, and new power centers were emerging in places few expected. For the clans, this was not a warning but an invitation, a sign that the future was opening a new chapter in the story of global influence. And just as their predecessors had navigated the gold fields, the industrial age, and the financial revolutions, they prepared to step into this next cycle with the same quiet determination that had defined them for generations. If you stayed with me through this entire journey, Let me know by leaving a comment saying the phrase, "This message was for me." And if this exploration of hidden patterns and global shifts brought clarity or insight, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep unfolding these stories together. Do not forget to leave a like as well. It helps deepen this conversation and strengthens the connection we have built along the way. There's another video here that expands on these themes, so click and continue with me as we move into the next chapter of this unfolding narrative.